Okay, I am going to get started, everyone. Great to see some new faces and some old faces this particular webinar. Welcome to Sprout Labs webinar on empowering learning with AI. I'm Robin Pettit, the founder of Sprout Labs and the host of the Learning While Working podcast. As we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm joining from today, the Mullooly people. It's very odd. I sit there and also have to acknowledge the fact that they didn't actually survive colonization. So I have to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the Twitter who now look after this land that I'm joining from. I pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Community Islander people that are joining me today. I pay my respects to your elders, past, present, future, and emerging. Now, I also just want to explain something that I've never done before. So you might notice that my head's tilting to one side and my head's moving around. That's actually not nerves at all. I have a neurological condition called generalized dystonia, which basically means the connections between my brain and some of the movement parts of my body are misfiring. When I was in the neurologist office and they said, "You've got dystonia," I went, "What's that?" And it's actually this I mean, I've taken it on and I'm going to start to educate more about it because it's actually the third most common neurological movement disorder. And there's actually 20,000 people in Australia who actually have it. And it can actually sometimes take up to 20 years to be diagnosed with it because there's such a lack of awareness. So back to the core webinar after I've explained my odd movement stuff. I still wave my arms around a lot, by the way, as well. So one of the things I do is I host a podcast called the Learning While Working podcast. And this webinar is really based on a series of interviews from the podcast. I had got to the stage where I was actually at the spot where I was sitting there going, "Oh, I'm really excited about this. I don't really know what's happening. I'd love to talk about this." And I sat there and went, "Actually, I'm probably not going to ever know what's actually happening. Gee, wonder what happens if I send out a message to my past guests on the podcast about what they're doing." And I got this lovely response from all my community about what they're doing. And that was a sort of starting point for the particular podcast. Bit about Sprout Labs. So essentially, we work with digital learning platforms that help you and your team also to measure and deliver high impact learning ecosystems. So we sort of try to think about things beyond just courses. We work with two things: our own platform, Glasshouse, which is a content-focused learning experience platform, and Tatara Learn. I talked about the podcast. If you're new to Sprout Labs, there's actually lots of other things. There's ebooks, there's recordings of lots of past webinars and the recordings from our virtual conferences as well. Sometime this year, we probably will do another virtual conference. This is sort of the structure of what we're talking about today. Some practical strategies to integrate AI into your work. Things around actually rethinking the learning process. And then last but not least, some of the things I've heard during the podcast interviews and heard in other discussions around how people are dealing with some of the privacy and security issues. Now, this is a fairly interactive session, so even before we get started, I'm going to actually ask you all a question. What do you want to gain from this session? Now, this does two things for me. It means I can actually possibly change some of my messaging during the session. And it also means I can sometimes sit there and go, "Oh, okay, that might make a really good follow-up blog post," or I could talk to someone about that topic on the podcast, or actually sometimes even what people have said, I sit there and go, "Actually, that's a whole another webinar as well." So I just really want, it's also just as a group, it's nice to share this particular thing. It's a very, very traditional way of getting started. Cool. Thank you, Kerry, for getting us started. You're curious. Cool. Well, this content. Okay, I've actually even got some prompt examples happening a little bit later. Ah, okay. John, positive things. Marianne, just a general view, practical strategies. Ooh, Aaron, the how. Okay. It's actually interesting. I'm working on another series of like a 6 sessions, and that's very much about the how, and there's just a little bit on the how here. Yeah. Cool. Alison about education design. Okay, cool. Marianne, I will talk about actually one of the things with some of the with some of this sort of application, especially that one, um, as well, about how people are upskilling. I'll talk about an example that hasn't been actually released on the podcast. Cool, awesome. Thank you, everyone. Now we're going to do a whiteboard activity next, which is partly a lead on from some of that. So still feel like I didn't need to do a little bit of a crash course on this particular on the whiteboard tool. If you go up to the spot top of your screen, you can see the view options and you can click back down and go to annotate. Or if you're on a Mac, there's a little icon on the right, on the left-hand corner that you can click to get your icon tools up. Basically, most of the activities we're going to be doing are visual selection tools. And if you could actually just, then they're actually really just using the stamp tool. So if you just want to have a quick go, for people to stamp something on the screen, that would be fantastic. And that gives me a chance to actually get my annotation tools up as well. So I can actually, awesome. I just need to feel confident enough that when I ask people in a few moments to do things, I'm not going to get a blank response. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to delete everything and move into our next slide. Now, could you put a mark where you sit in this? If you're using AI as part of your workflow right at the top, if you're not, then put it somewhere on the horizontal scale, because I'm actually also interested about whether or not this is like a skills or whether or not it's about blocking this completely, or you actually just don't see quite yet actually how it can be useful for you in your actual work. So cool. We're getting some people through there. Ah, that's interesting. There's some people in that whole not seeing that it's actually useful. This gives me a chance to talk a little bit about two family members. Uh, my the family business is actually a plumbing business, and I don't think my brother-in-law uses much AI in his work. My wife's a jeweler, and she doesn't use AI in much of her work either. And that's actually interesting because essentially both of those are very practical, physical things. So the nature of the AI as we're seeing at the moment is actually in a spot where it is actually really around knowledge and language. Okay. Now, what's fascinating for me is there's not many people in this spot that are in this workplace block. That's interesting, Nick, in terms of the annotation. I can't remember about whether or not it's a web. I do know if you're on a tablet or a mobile, you can't do the annotation. So I'll just try to remember to actually, and I sometimes do forget to sit there and say, if you can't use the annotation, just put your response in chat. Cool. Thank you, everyone. It's actually really interesting to see how many people actually are using. And that's actually great for a few different reasons. Now, in the early podcasts, I found myself talking about the fact that this feels like the early days of the internet, 1994. I'm showing my age, by the way, here. And it's this time when it's sort of really exciting. People were making lists of websites. And it's just like in the same way people are making lists of tools. People are excited about what's a new tool. People are excited about what's a new website. So there was this energy. Also, we didn't completely know how to use it. So quite often we're actually copying what we've done in the past. The other thing that's interesting is the internet did actually exist before 1994. In 1993, I discovered Gopher, which was like a folder of text-based content. 1994, you had the explosion of Mosaic, and it was a visual way of working. So just in the same way that ChatGPT has sat there and given all of us just like a really accessible, really easy way of being able to access AI. And that's one of the really big shifts. I also think it's interesting. We've still got a lot to figure out about things. I was also thinking about this and thinking about how concerned people were around copyright of artists putting up images on websites or writers putting up text and being worried that people were going to take away all the livelihoods. And it's interesting to see how that's all playing through as well. Again, now, question or a statement from me and from many other people, especially from the founder, some of the people who are sort of researchers. AI will be smarter than a single human. I'm just interested in teasing out as a group what does this idea of smart means, and that I mean essentially and then you're really happy to agree with this as well, just disagree. I mean, because it's sort of this idea about what the notion of smart it is. So it's very unusual to actually have like ChatGPT can pass the bar exam as well as the theoretical part of some of the medical examinations. So that's a very unusual set of knowledge for a single human being to have. Cool. We've got Nick that you got this the whole you don't agree that AI. Or Angus' ability to discern. Well, Renee, that's a lovely way I think about it. It's knowledge, and Carl's also talking about this idea of book smart. It can retain more knowledge and information than what a brain can, or maybe what a brain can. We still don't know completely what brains can and can't do, but that is actually only book knowledge and book smart. Oh, curious, that's a lovely definition of what it is. And in actual fact, I've really wrestled with some of this particular stuff because I really wanted to talk about how it works, and then actually by then talking about how it works, how it looks smart, but it's actually quite dumb as well. Or managing ethical dilemmas. There was a really good podcast towards the beginning talking about the fact that, in actual fact, we probably shouldn't ever actually trust AIs, and especially generative AIs, about whether or not we are actually making decisions about things. As I've been doing this work and thinking, yeah, I've actually found myself actually thinking about what it actually means to be human. And I actually think the only one knowledge and this idea of smart is actually only one component of being a human. There is actually so much more to being a human than what essentially the knowledge base have. And for me, is we have bodies, we exist in the world. We connect when we know things. I've really wrestled with the idea that AI systems can be creative because they can make new things and they can combine things in new ways, which is quite often a definition of creativity. It was actually one of our team members, Monica, a graphic designer, and she sat there and went, her superpower was creative expression. And I was like, that's it. Actually, expression, that's the word. So that's actually something, because we have bodies, empathy, love, care, we can then express that in our world. I think the other thing is, and this is the thing that we need to think through very carefully, is we need we are naturally tool users and builders, and we have always been, and we will keep on being. So it's about this new thing that we've got in front of us, starting to work through that in a very different new way. Now, interesting quote. Peter Diamandis travels with an MD after his name. He's actually never really been a doctor. He actually, after his medical degree, he moved into tech and now really works in venture capital. He's a really interesting person, runs a podcast and a conference that quite often thinks about work, the future, and also does lots of work around longevity. And this is a quote that he's actually talked about a couple of times. What I really like about this is actually not sitting there saying a doctor's going to be replaced, but it's about this sense that there's hundreds of thousands of new research papers coming out all the time. Medical scanning can create so much data. AI can actually be used to help understand what some of those things may be. And not be in a spot where the actual decision making is actually being made by an AI. The decision making is having that lovely thought that people are having of it's a sentinel human beings where we think and connect. So what this means is, in actual fact, we many people are, and we will be keeping on working alongside AI. There's a quote that gets, and I decided not to use it, that gets kicked around a lot on the screen, but I'm going to say it. It's most jobs are very unlikely to be replaced by an AI, but you may be replaced by someone using an AI system. So is this thing about working alongside rather than it being a replacement? Now, at the same time, this working alongside is interesting. ChatGPT can create computer code, but that doesn't mean if you go in and ask for, I want a piece of code that does dot dot in dot dot language, that doesn't all of a sudden make you a coding expert. First of all, you probably you don't know whether or not that code's right. It's just made stuff up. You don't know how to run it. You don't know how to test it. There's all this other stuff that actually makes someone an expert. But at the same time, in actual fact, there's been a huge adoption in coding of some of the AI tools like Copilot. It's actually been proven that people who are using them are actually working about 20% faster. And that's quite a considerable productivity gain. So what's happening with this type of situation is, in actual fact, work's shifting, which then means, in actual fact, learning shifting. So quite often we forget that in actual fact we're part of a flow on from the other bigger things that are happening in workplaces. And our role is possibly to help people become aware of the possibilities, aware of the risks, aware of the tools, aware of actually how we can work and how we can actually adopt things as well. So there's a couple of cases where the L&D teams were really pioneering things as well. And that was a really interesting moment because I was sitting there going, well, it's relatively low risk to use some of these tools in learning content development compared to using them with customers. Let's learn from using them in content development. And then as an organization, we can then maybe apply those learnings back into the main parts of the operations. The rest of the session is going to be sort of structured around these three things. What AI and L&D has been used for now, content creation, and this whole rethinking. Probably by the time I finish this particular session, this is all going to be out of date and is going to be in a very different spot. So everything changes very, very quickly. And so that's probably the first thing to be aware of. Now, in multiple podcast interviews, and it was actually with Josh Cavalier to start with, I found myself talking about what people's superpowers are. So essentially, could you grab a stamp? And I'm doing this based on a media-based approach rather than actually like, oh, my superpowers writing multiple choice questions or my superpowers designing really powerful interactions. So in actual fact, I'll use a couple of examples. Cara North is an assessment specialist. So I sat there and said, so are you using any of these AI tools for doing any design of multiple choice questions? She said, no, they produce terrible multiple choice questions. And I went, oh, okay, I'm using them to draft stuff. That's interesting. And then Pedram, who's a facilitating and facilitated developer, he actually did a thing where he sat there and went, he talked about the fact that every time he tried to get something working in a way where he tried to make an activity with an AI tool, it always produced terrible activities. So that was his superpower. I'm going to put my stamp here because I'm going to say, you might notice I do webinars and I do a podcast. So I'm actually just really good at talking. And that's actually probably my thing as well. Cool. Got a few visual communication people. Not many, lots of people working with written language. She's interesting. Learning people were quite often used to talking and then also used to being in a spot where we write as well. Cool. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm just going to clear this. Hold that for a moment. So this is probably, if you're great at working with written language, you're probably not going to ever use an AI to do that. You're always going to be better at that than what it actually is. So the other part of my life is as a visual artist, and I find working with some of the AI visual generators incredibly frustrating because they just produce what I see as stereotypical, literal, uncomplicated bits of visual communication. So it's that sense that you keep your superpowers, but what becomes really interesting where we start to sit there and think about, well, what's actually our kryptonite? What's our weaknesses? So I'm going to sit there and say, in actual fact, my weakness is actually working with written language. So in actual fact, I now spend lots of time using voice to text, great at verbal language, then getting ChatGPT or Bard to be able to rewrite that and rework that in a way that's actually right for me. And then I actually, once I can see what that's rewritten, I can then proofread it and write it and rework it. So for me, that becomes like I can work with that sort of weakness in a really different way. The working with verbal language is interesting in terms of the kryptonite. I'm just going to sit there and say, chat, I'm using PowerPoint to present. We've got captions also operating in Zoom. I'm seeing a lot of people actually running those at the same time. Actually, we're doing some work with someone at the moment who's as a facilitator, he said, my hearing's actually not great, and I'm now running captions all the time because in actual fact, that's actually meaning he can work on, he can actually understand more about what's happening with the verbal language. So we've got this cluster around working with moving with images, which is sort of interesting this week as well, because I'll talk about that in a moment. So I clear the drawings. Back to there. Now, this is not every tool on the face of the earth. But if you're sitting there thinking around your weakness being, say, moving image or video generation, the type of tools you might be starting to think about are things like Runway or HeyGen. And HeyGen is a spot where essentially you can put in a piece of text, it can generate a voiceover, and it can also generate a avatar as well. So it's sort of that moment where you sit there and go, well, basically my superpower is maybe writing. Actually, what my weakness is image generation or video generation. I'm going to learn how to use those tools, and those are going to be actually what I'm going to use in my workflows to get better at this. So please use that logic, because essentially it came up in multiple podcasts when people just sat there and went, oh no, I never use an AI for that type of thing. Or when I have, it's just produced absolutely terrible results that I'm just not happy with. So this is basically what I'm talking about. Now this can also work with teams and functions as well. There's one podcast that hasn't been released yet where basically in an organization, they're prototyping the use of generative AI in a learning team. So what they then did is sit there and go, well, what's the most difficult part of what we do? Actually, this initial conversation between the learning designer and the subject matter expert. Okay, let's really focus in on that particular problem that we have, and we all have it. So it's a most challenging part. I sometimes sit there and in the podcast sit there and go, okay, so in another podcast we're talking about asking really powerful questions, and it just keeps on coming up as a topic. So they basically just drilled into that and then built a library of that for a library of prompts. I'll talk about prompt in a few moments. That basically you allow the team to be able to use those when they're planning some of those meetings. Cool. Thank you, Helen. Talk about crash course in this thing called prompt engineering. So a lot of people who possibly were in that spot that you felt like you didn't have the skills. So probably the thing that you might just need to think about is this whole idea of actually designing your prompts. So rather than going into a tool like Gemini or ChatGPT and just starting to chat, actually starting to really think about what you're actually really wanting to do. So the big picture, what came up in the interviews is that you did need, with prompting, you need to be really specific about what you want. And I'll actually give some examples of this in a few moments, because in actual fact, there's a few things that it's not perfect in terms of what I just showed, because I wasn't even specific enough. Define the outcome you want. Because a tool like ChatGPT can give you different lengths of text. It can also give you different formats. If you like, it can give you tables. It can actually produce a format that can then be put into a mind map. It can produce images for you. So you actually just define the outcome you want, both in medium as well as what you might want as well. The other thing that I realized that actually when doing some work with team members, coach and correct. If it gives you the wrong thing, sit there and say, no, that's not what I want. I don't like that. Change it in this way, or change it in that way, or you've done the completely wrong thing, or actually just make sure you sit there and go, yes, that's good, because then it will keep on doing the same thing into the future as well. So that's actually quite important. So this is an example of a type of, I think of it as a one-shot prompt. And I personally have found this idea of the act as an expert is really useful. So these models have this huge amount of information and knowledge in them, as we talked about before. And this act as an expert means you sort of go into a bit of it and you sit there and go, we're just focusing in on this certain part of your huge knowledge base. And that just gets some different types of results as well. Giving a bit more context and a bit more background, and then the requests as well. So there's actually sometimes when I'll actually also do things like sit there and then the background information, do some voice to text, talk for 10, 15 minutes, put all that text in as well to actually help build up this. And then the format of what I'm asking for as well. Now, it's really interesting with that format, by the way. So I got 2 results back from it. I got this story, and it's terrible. It's atrocious. It's exactly the type of thing which it's just like that moment you sit there and go, oh, this just doesn't feel at all right. It's that moment where I'd sit there and go, okay, I'm not going to use that. Actually, I'm probably not even going to use that as an instructional design approach, because as soon as I saw it, it was like, I don't think that's ever going to work, no matter what, as an approach. But it's a really good example of the fact that you have to be, as a human here, who's actually wiser and more sentinel and more connected, you have to be edit, change, and work with these things. You don't just sit there and go, oh, yes, that's perfect. So what was more interesting was this draft of the multiple choice question. And it was all like, okay, so that's actually a interesting moment. This is interesting. Okay, this is actually giving me some options. That's good. That's good, giving some good feedback as well. You know what I forgot to ask it to do? Decide if one was right or if one was wrong. So we actually have some ones that are sort of actually beautifully grey that's as well. So I've only got one that sits there and says it's actually a really good response, but it doesn't sort of sit there and say, oh yes, this is actually our completely correct answer to work with. So that's like this starting off something. Now, the other way to work with, especially ChatGPT and the other chat style tools, and we are in a really interesting moment with the ChatGPT tools, because essentially last week Google released Gemini and renamed Bard to Gemini, and people are actually starting to sit there and say that Gemini models are giving better, more interesting, more detailed, more accurate, more human-like language, less marketing speak than what ChatGPT is. And I think that's a really interesting thing. So that's that whole, the world keeps on changing. Now, one of the things that actually keeps on happening, one thing that happened, and it was actually in one podcast, someone talked about the fact that rather than this whole single prompt, it's actually quite often a workflow. So this is actually quite often the workflow I now use if I'm working with something. To start with, I sit there and say, act as dot dot. And then I might sit there and go, well, let's use multiple choice questions as an example. Give me 7 principles of what a good multiple choice question is. It'll put some guffs through. Then if I don't like those, I sit there and say, give me some more, take this out, put this in, da, 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 da. And then I sit there and go, use those principles when I ask you to make a multiple choice question. So I sort of given it that sort of context. And then you sort of sit there and go, okay, so let's build up our personas. If you've got your personas, who your learners are, you put those in and sit there and say, these are our learners. What do you think this might mean for these learners in this particular case here? And then you sit there and maybe sit there and say, okay, so our learning problems dot dot and the situation and context is dot dot. I didn't do any of this in that single prompt. And then you give it as much background. And then finally you request the format. So this actually might be over like 10 different interactions to build up this full workflow. One great thing about this is that in actual fact, you can then keep on going back to this chat session to keep on working with this over a period of time. And that then just means you're not actually putting in, say, who the learners are at the beginning all the time. You've actually got that running. All the tools have a limit to how many words they can actually understand over a period of time. So you do eventually run out of words as well. So I've got a couple of little lines at the top about the expertise principles and the request with the format at the top. We are now starting to see tools like the articulate tools starting to come out with AI tools inside of them. That's what they're doing. Quite often they actually will have the expertise. They'll sit there and say, act as an instructional designer in the background and be pulling this down into a better spot as well, and then making sure the request is in the right format as well. I haven't seen any of them that are doing the who the learners are yet at all. Now, another thing, if content has become this easy to produce, it raises the question is, do we actually need more content? L&D. Do we need to actually be rethinking what we're doing and how we're doing it rather than just making more content? Got a thought experiment for you all. If AI could generate and deliver by, say, using a personal chatbot for every person in your organization, what would you then focus on instead? Ethics, yeah. Feedback, and yes, that's a really good example, and that's a really good example of where someone giving really good feedback. And Nick, probably the problem is if AI was generating all the content and doing all the delivery, there would be a whole series of ethics problems around that. It's interesting. Feedback, evaluation, assessment, really personalized things, personalized interactions. Thinking about learning the reasoning, that's a really nice one, Helen. What's the reasons? Yeah, application. So you sit there and say all of a sudden, okay, instant feedback. User experience, actually thinking about actually how it all handles together. I also wonder, as we're doing this, is whether or not this is actually what we should be doing anyway. It's interesting, especially for me around that assessment and feedback stage and having that human thinking skills about maybe this is just what we should always be focusing on anyway. Just a thought. So moving into the other two areas where AI is being applied, which is really, I think about them as rethinking learning experiences. The first one is really around new ideas and new approaches. So one thing, a bit less relevant to most people here, but I'm really excited about what ChatGPT means for assessment in education, especially in higher education, because isn't it fantastic that essentially people are having to sit there and go, well, if ChatGPT can produce the essay, maybe actually we shouldn't be asking the learners to do that anyway. Maybe we should be actually asking the learners to do something, make something, have an interaction, and then maybe write about that and reflect on that, but actually do something and actually have some sort of authentic assessment. So I think that's actually one really interesting thing. And then, and this is where the whole creative thing comes in. It is a really interesting thing, is it can actually be really useful for this stage of brainstorming. Basically because sighing a little bit, because it's extremely good at connecting different ideas together without our inbuilt filters on things. So we all sit there and quite often have our, oh, I really like learning in this way, or our learners like doing it like this way, or I've seen this, and you naturally go to those. So because it's dumb about all those context things, it doesn't actually come up with any of those things. So here's another example of a type of prompt that could be used for brainstorming different ideas. This came in for me partly for this week. In the ARIA there was a really nice case study of ATO thinking about well-being and productivity in a really different way, and really doing things in changing in a really different way as well. So I sat there and thought, oh, wonder what would happen if we threw this at ChatGPT. So much the same format in terms of the structure of it. Act as, project, bit about the problem, what you want as a request, and then also what you don't want. Doesn't always work, by the way. Doesn't always sit there and say it doesn't want. It's actually, there's some very telling things sometimes about the text that comes back out of some of these things. I've been recruiting recently for a customer support and a customer experience person, and part of the recruitment process was responding to a help desk request. And many had delves in there. As we delve into this, and delves is a really common ChatGPT word, and it was one of those moments of sitting there going, yeah, okay, I make sure I've got my things set up so it never says delves. So what's interesting here is you may have sat down and come up with some of these ideas as a group or with a group of people, and that could have actually been, and it is actually a great co-design thing, but this possibly just sort of opens up sometimes for different people's possibilities about what it actually could be as well. So this is a nice sort of thing about being able to sort of sit there and go, how can we get away from content delivery to possibly building things that are more active learning experiences by actually using the tools to rethink how we're working. Now, the other side of it is using AI as part of learning experiences. So really nice podcasts with the amazing Megan Torrance, talking about how they actually used Storyline and short answers in Storyline, hooked up with some code to be able to give feedback on short answer questions. And that was a really interesting thing because, and she was working in medical education as well, because so essentially things that really have no black and white answer quite often. They're things that have lots of vague graynesses to them. So they make terrible multiple choice questions. So short answer questions. And so essentially they basically sat there and said, this is a question. Here is 5 different examples of good short answer questions. And then I asked ChatGPT to do the feedback automatically. So the actual learner got real feedback. They'll sit there and say, oh, compared to my model responses, your response is ... And if I was to give that a score, it would be like 7 out of 10 compared to the model responses I've been told. Just a really nice way of being able to give better feedback to people as well. Yeah, and chat and then we've got these tools that Helen's just talked about, which is these custom chatbots and topics on different types of knowledge bases. So there's a huge amount of activity, lots of things being released around personalized tutors. I think this is really interesting because we've never had these types of tools for personalized tutors. We, as learning people, we sort of feel like that we're in a spot where we know if someone's given one-on-one tutoring, it is a powerful learning experience. I also know that getting people to be self-guided learners is a powerful thing. I also know that actually people learning together is a powerful thing. So we still know that. But what's really interesting with past personal tutors is they actually haven't shown, like the computerized, digitalized ones, actually haven't shown to be that much effective. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that pans out. So the other one, and Megan talked about this a bit as well in her podcast, of learners using chatbots to practice. So you essentially give them a prompt to maybe do something, which then they might review what it came back with. They might create something, review it, or then use it for even, say, doing role plays and practicing, and then sort of looking back at it as well. So I think this is actually where we've got lots of work and really exciting things to actually happen in terms of using ChatGPT. So even this is this moment where if actually training and helping learners actually figure out how to use these tools for self-guided learning could actually be more powerful than having the existing content libraries that we pay a lot of money for. Now, this all does have some risks. And for me, these personally fall into 2 things. Generative AI generates things. It makes stuff up. It makes stuff up all the time. That's what it's designed to do. It builds connections. Sometimes it can connect things with the right things, but at other times it makes totally the wrong connections, and it really doesn't do things right. You ask it for a reference, it makes up the reference as well. Which I'm laughing because I think that's actually a really fun thing to do, to sit there and go, well, how do you know that? And then all of a sudden it chats something out, and then it sits there and does a whole actually it's dot, and then you go, actually that journal doesn't even exist. What are you talking about? Now, we don't also really know what's happening with the data that we're giving these chatbots. So this is actually quite a large risk for businesses and organizations. I have been at Sprout Labs very resistant to the developers using the chat tools integrated with our code base because of this. So it's interesting. I'm talking like an early adopter, and I'm also sitting there going, well, I'm not quite sure about our IP and our possible security issues that could be found going somewhere that we don't really know what is really happening with it. So it wasn't until some of the tools started to become a lot more transparent, I started to feel comfortable as a manager and leader to sit there and say these tools are actually safe to use. And we're still playing with it, to be honest, because I'm still fairly untrusting. Couple of things I've heard in the podcasts and through other discussions about how people are dealing with some of these things. First of all, they're basically saying they're going, yes, we will use ChatGPT, but our people will use that in terms of that we'll put a chat interface in front of it that logs and monitors everything that goes through. So if we think that something is going into the chat interface internally that shouldn't be, that's sensitive business information, that's a policy, that's a process, that's a name of an employee or customer, it then logs that, maybe blocks it, but it's also just logging it backwards and forwards. So that's actually one approach. The other approach that's actually I've heard it been happening in quite high risk areas. If you have an existing cloud provider, to actually use the services they are using. It has its pros and cons for us in Australia as well. So let's just pick on Amazon Web Services because that's the one I know best. So that it does have a number of these services packaged up in a way with open source tools, so you know what they've been trained on. You've got more transparency, and it's very, very likely that the growth in internal tools will be in these open models and open sourcing. But all the tech at the moment is running outside of Australia, so that's then got another set of issues with it as well. So maybe for us in Australia, this is still something that's not quite there with the using the existing cloud providers. As I'm talking, I don't know what's happening on the Microsoft side of things, but it's just one of those things to sit there and go, okay, so our existing decision is to use Microsoft. Let's use their tools. We trust them. We'll bring them into the fold. Then I talked about this sort of making things up. So one of the key things for this particular thing is this is actually a good role for us in L&D. It's actually good for us to be able to be in a spot where we're helping people design prompts, think about how they can use it, think about how to re-engineer things, think about how to work faster. But at the same time, thinking about the critical skills, sitting there going, is this the right thing to be doing, to be using AI for this particular thing? Actually, that's produced a bit of content I don't particularly think's right. I need to do my fact checking on that, or wonder why it's produced that. So to be able to actually sit there and think below the surface is what I think of as critical thinking skills, to be able to be in a spot where you can actually sort of go underneath things as well. So I think this is some of those things. At this stage where you're in a spot where you've got this spot where I think it's sort of, well, I think of this human skills, critical thinking skills, creative expressions, collaboration skills are going to become more and more important to what we do in L&D because of knowledge skills become easier. Nick's actually put something I think that's actually really important. Public-facing material is just using things that you sit there and you go, actually public-facing material and all your prompts as well, and keeping them in a workbook. A couple of the projects we've actually used on for instructional design are literally designed for mass consumption of people. They're open resources or to public. So it's that moment with open content, and it's the moment to sit there and go, actually, none of this is actually business processes, so it's not in a spot where it's being shared, which is that's one reason why I've been confident with that. But I think that's actually a really good principle, Nick. Cool. I managed to finish a little bit earlier. So, classic facilitator question. I'm actually start with a really easy facilitation questions at the beginning and end of these webinars, partly because I know that it's actually just it's a 1 hour thing. So I try to keep these sort of interactions fairly light. Um, could you share what you're going to apply what you've learned today? And I will get the recording and also the slides up later today or tomorrow as well, and the messages out. For me, I've had all of these conversations, done a lot of reading while I've been having those conversations as well. And this has been a really nice way of being able to distill down some of what I've actually learned during those conversations and that time. As I said, I expect this to be all out of date by the time that the podcast is finished. So do actually also keep on up with things. Well, actually, I should have said one of my favorite newsletters at the moment is called Superpower AI. It's just really good for lots of different reasons. Oh, yeah, and there were some great things shared in terms of some of those links to lots of different tools, feeding back to the team, the importance of prompt engineering. Yeah, Kim, keep on exploring. I think that's actually possibly one. Exploring and having something new is actually one of the reasons why I got excited about it again. And that's where the 1994 bit comes in. It's like, actually, something that's new. Cool, Renee. Yeah, I think that's actually really important. I think that's actually one of those things that people quite often will be in a spot where they'll sit there and you try to use the tools for doing what they normally do during their job, and then they sit there and go, "This is terrible. This is not as good as what I can do." And then all of a sudden, yeah, because they're trying to use them for doing their superpowers. Him, yep. Workflows, Murray. Cool. Nice to see you, Murray, by the way. And it's the first time I've seen you chat in the chat and don't have my participant list up. Cool. Thank you. Some really interesting things there. The she said privacy guidelines is an interesting one because I've actually heard in K-12 that being used like a classic group rules thing, but like a whole, if we're going to use AI in the classroom, what's our ethics around using it? And how are you personally going to use that? And I think that is actually that's a good one to think through as well. And we will have more of those things coming back through at an organizational level as well, rather than just a total blocking like we're sometimes seeing at the moment. Thank you, everyone. I'll stop my screen share. And I will just hang around and for a few moments if you want as well if you're in a spot where if you've got any questions or anything, we'll actually stop the recording as well.